it wasn't necessarily that I was the teacher, but we together were exploring the language, and I was so happy in those moments. So that's definitely one an early on experience of feeling that there's magic in being together and learning together rather than being on your own with the book and exploring a topic.
This is a podcast called Walk, Talk, Listen. An attempt to connect people and make this world a bit better by sharing opinions and experiences based on the belief that everyone's perspective is true, albeit partial. My name is Maurice Blom, and I would like to welcome you to yet another episode of Walk, Talk, Listen. Okay, good day, everybody. This is another episode of the podcast Walk, Talk, Listen. And as always, I'm delighted with today's guests, live from the Netherlands. Jeanine, please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Maurice. Thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to be part of this journey, this walking journey. My name is Jeanine Jansen, and I live in Amsterdam. I have a background in facilitation, change, and groups. I'll say, of course, a little bit more about that later. And I have my own organization, Remember the Talent, and I work at Nijrode. I also just finished my research on group dynamics, which we'll go into. And next to all that official introductions, I'm the mother of Benjamin, married to Jouke. And I think a very passionate person about change and learning. So looking forward to have a conversation.
Yeah, no, and thanks for that introduction, Jeanine. I did a little bit of my homework. You have published a lot, and you have a website, etc. And when you look at that, there is a description around, you were saying, and which is also, I think, quoted in your dissertation, your PhD study is. I'm telling this because it seems to be important for you. So you describe your background as mixed, colonial, and mention that your roots are, a deep inspiration for your work. So could you maybe share a bit about your upbringing and how that diversity maybe shaped your view on groups and belonging today?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for picking that up. Yes, so the question of my inquiry was, how do I, as a facilitator with Dutch mixed colonial roots, how do I inquire into groups differently? And indeed, that wasn't how I started off, but eventually those roots became an important red thread. So to go into that, I was born on the 22nd of January, 1982. In a very diverse family, although at the time I didn't realize that, because for me, these were just my parents and, my cousins and my uncles and aunts and grandparents. But now looking back, it was quite diverse in terms of education, culture, all kinds of differences, I would say. Age, location where people lived and grew up. So, for instance, an aunt moved to Sweden before I was born. So I have Swedish cousins on the one side. I also have cousins on Curaçao, which is an island from the Dutch colonial history. I have German roots, Austrian roots, and there's many more. I was born in Haarlem, which is in the upper part of the Netherlands, and we moved a little while after into also a very diverse neighborhood, but in a very, I would say, not so much mixed community in Alkmaar. And I think my parents, they just fell in love at age 16. They met, the classic story, dancing, falling in love, didn't really realize something about their backgrounds, as I think it should often be when it comes to love. And then finding the struggle of telling their parents and noticing that it wasn't maybe so obvious for them to be a couple at the time, early 80s. My mother was a very good salsa dancer, so gradually she became accepted by the friends of my father and vice versa, but it took some time. And I have a brother, Fabian. He's 3 years younger than I am. So the four of us, we dealt with difference very differently, I would say. And I only now realize that for me, it was a big topic because no one looked like me in the community where I was born. So a lot of differences. And one of the questions I received from a very early age was, where do you come from? Where are you born? Where are you from? Tell me about your history. So the question you ask me now, but let's say with a different connotation. And I guess that many people will answer this question from their own perspective. For me, it was the realization that, oh, maybe it's not so obvious that I'm born here and I belong and I'm part of this community. And it made me very, but now that's also only looking back, very aware of the difference in my community. I had a very loving childhood. My parents showed immense love and appreciation for us as children and really encouraged us to grow and try things and very supportive. I really liked going to school. I was a very curious girl, really literally dancing to school, enjoying every day, being sort of a model child in a sense. Um, so not so much of a rebel as I could have been, I guess. And
And
yeah, I
was that
think
true for your siblings as well?
I think so.
Mm.
I think so. We are quite different, my brother and I,
Mhm.
but I just think we have this basis of love and, in a sense, self-confidence, or at least appreciation. And I think that that's very important that we both had that.
And if I may ask, so you said, you know, your parents being a couple was not that obvious, so that, you know, they didn't go smooth from the beginning. Why was that?
I guess because they were from very different backgrounds, they also have a different racial makeup. So in the early 80s, in the region I was born, that wasn't so common. My father, actually, when he moved to the Netherlands, he was one of the few colored people in his region. So he faced discrimination and racism in a way. So that's literally what I meant. Yeah.
Mhm. Okay.
Yeah.
Did you, so you were alluding to when you grew up, you also looked different. Were you also experiencing that?
Not nearly as my father. I did feel a little bit exotic. And I stood out. I was also very tall for my age. I was taller than most teachers also at my primary school at the time. And so I stood out, and people would notice my appearance, and all I wanted was to be part of the group and not stand out in a way. So that was definitely part of my story. But my brother, for instance, he responded very differently when he realized that he had a different kind of background than most children in our community. He would even exaggerate that a little and learn the language from my father's native side. And so it's also how you respond to things. It's not only what, your situation is, but also how you deal with that. And mine was to sort of become a little um, shy in a way. And yeah, but that's only
Try to
looking back.
conform more to the group.
Absolutely, to fit in and belong,
Hmm.
and absolutely,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So you mentioned that you liked to learn and to go to school. Where did that lead to, you know?
I went to the university at age 18, studied sociology. I didn't really know I had a new goal every year. So journalism, I wanted to learn languages, and I ended up in sociology, which I think isn't a coincidence, but at the time it wasn't a very conscious choice. I could have done many things. And alongside of that, I started to work in education. While I was doing my studies, I had time left, so I wanted to do something, and there was a school nearby, um, a secondary school, very practical school, and I worked with children almost my own age. I was their sort of teacher assistant, and it was a nice dynamic because I wasn't the teacher, and I didn't have their role, so I had this sort of mediator role in between. And it was a very lively community with people from Turkey, Morocco, and mentioned practical in the sense that these students weren't nearly the people who would, or necessarily the people who would dive into books and study and have the, let's say, cognitive interests to study as I was doing, but they really had a lot of practical knowledge about what they were doing. So one of the things we did was to try to develop competence-based learning. So how do you work with what's already there in terms of talent and practical knowledge? So these mostly girls were actually studying to become someone who would be helping in the social domain, for instance, in schools or in daycare. And they already had large families, helping their brothers and sisters, their siblings. So there was a lot of knowledge already, but it was a practical knowledge. And I loved creating exams and material that aligned with what they already had in store. And it was a lovely way of stepping into education and also applying some of the sociology teachings that I was receiving at the time. So I loved those worlds. And next to that, I worked at a private secondary school, sort of an elite school, I would say. Most of the children, they had something challenging, which made it challenging for them, difficult to have, let's say, the highest diploma. And their parents were sort of, I would say, a little bit disappointed. So they tried in a private school, if the regular schools weren't working, to make them have that diploma. And there was a lot of frustration because in a way they didn't fit into the, let's say, mainstream way of working. And that was really challenging. So those two experiences really shaped how I look at education, how it's important to appreciate what's already there and different ways of intelligence, different forms of intelligence, and work with that in a playful way within the boundaries of what's, of course, possible and also allowed. But I became very playful in working with what we had in terms of resources and groups. Yeah.
Okay. So just a quick step back. To which university did you go?
To Vrije Universiteit,
In
Free
Amsterdam.
University.
Okay.
Amsterdam.
Okay.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah.
And so then the schools that you were also engaged with, teaching or helping to assist, that was also in Amsterdam.
Amsterdam based. Yeah, I was
Wow.
studying there. Yeah. I was commuting between Alkmaar and Amsterdam for a
Oh,
while.
okay. Yeah.
And then at one point I was looking for jobs. I was just curious, what can you do with sociology? Because I actually had no clue. I was almost done, just a thesis to write. And then I found this vacancy at a little boutique consultancy, very small, around vision development and strategy and future thinking. And I thought, I'm just going to have a conversation. And I ended up there. It became my first job, actually. While I was still studying, and it was a very nice way to get to know the society from different perspectives and lenses, because there were questions from organizations and institutions about how do we deal with the future and what does it require and how do we translate that into a strategy that is actually helpful. And I came from sort of the background where I didn't have a lot of, let's say, intellectual discussions at the kitchen table, politics. I wasn't really aware of what was going on in the world. And then all of a sudden, I was right smack in the middle of these discussions politics. It was very, very helpful and insightful.
Yeah, just a quick question about your brother, because I'm always intrigued in terms of siblings. Sometimes they end up in the same direction, sometimes not. Yeah, so what is he doing?
Very different from my
Mm.
direction. So he didn't really like school the way I did.
Mm.
If he could just pass with like a mediocre grade, he was perfectly fine with that. He wouldn't even mention if he had a higher grade. He didn't really care about school until he found what he was really
Mm.
interested in, which was marketing at the time. And then very early on, he started his own company, very slowly and humble. I would say he would build that, and he's now quite successful. But his day is he's most happy when he's with 3 screens behind a
Mm.
computer. He works fully remote. There's a lot of data-driven energy in his field and in his organization. While the less I can spend behind a computer screen, the happier I am. Actually, data, numbers, Microsoft Excel, that's really not my game. So we are very different in that sense, absolutely. But I would say he's just as passionate, and I think we also have in common that the border between the private world and work is very, very fluid.
Mm.
We love talking about our work, and we don't really separate those very clearly. And I think that's the thing we have that's one of the things we have in common.
Okay. Okay, let us jump back to your degree, sociology, and then you're finished. Then what? What happened?
Yeah, so I started working before I really realized I was doing so, because the vacancy I saw during my studies was actually an internship, but I didn't realize that. And so I stepped into my first official role as a organizational advisor in future thinking and future scenarios. Looking back, I would have liked sort of a break between studying and working and traveling a bit, but I was so eager and enthusiastic, and I didn't really realize that what I was doing until I was fully in it. But I loved it, and what I loved is facilitating dialogues for clients, all kinds of organizations, more social oriented, commercial, large, smaller organizations, lots of public organizations actually, city councils within education. And we would develop future scenarios to invite the people in the organization to think radically different. So, for instance, imagine 3 very different futures. What would it require? What do they have in common? How can you prepare on those various future scenarios? And we would work with scientists, academics, but also artists and people who were experts in their fields, the clients of the organization or future generations, very diverse groups. And one of the things I would love was to facilitate those conversations where people would literally move from one scenario to the other and imagine what that would mean, and work with actors, for instance, who would play out what would happen to make it really real and impactful. It was a very nice time also because our director was very generous in involving us all. Actually, not only me, but we had a team of young consultants, and he really involved all of us in the whole project from start to finish. So that was very yeah, that was a wonderful time actually. Yeah.
Mm. Um, I mean, your your work and also your PhD, it is is around groups and how they function. Um,
Yeah.
when did that? Was there a moment in your life where growing up in your family, or this work that you just talked about, or your study, that you sense there is something off, missing in how we understand group life, and that's why I need to follow this.
I love this question, by the way. I don't have an immediate one answer. It's sort of my whole body of response, which I think is an answer, but it's not an answer in words, but it's a very sensed answer that this is important conversation. Well, because we are all group animals, I would say, and so we are all born into groups, communities, neighborhoods, families, and of course, at least for me, I would say that as a child, I didn't necessarily at first realized I was part of groups or wasn't, or, it's just there. It's like the air we breathe. It's very natural. And I do have many moments where that awareness started to grow. And one of which for me is that when I started secondary school, I was 12, 11, 12. Very early on, I was so enthusiastic about the whole idea of teaching that I just wanted to do more of that or experience more of that than, the 9 to 5 or 9 to 4 school experience. So I would invite my classmates to my living room or even my bedroom where I was living at the time. I had this old chalkboard and we would explore the French language together. So I would pass that around and say, okay, what did the teacher say? Let's repeat. And then it wasn't necessarily that I was the teacher, but we together were exploring the language. And I was so happy in those moments. So that's definitely an early on experience of feeling that there's magic in being together and learning together rather than being on your own with the book and exploring a topic. There was this communication, there was this collaboration. We would share knowledge and build on top of each other. And that's typically one. And
Is
my
that
father
something
would.
that your parents also did with you then? In terms of early reading, for example, or, what, when you come home, asking questions, what did you learn and tell us about it? Or
Yeah, it's funny that you say this because I just was about to say that my father was a teacher, sports teacher in primary education and secondary education. And in the weekends and in the evenings, he would also create group experience around sports for friends or family. And if it was our birthday, he would create let's say, a tour or a game. So there was a lot of shared experiences and learning and funnily enough, I now realize it was never about winning. So I don't really like sports and team games where there is a prize, but I do love this exploration, playfulness. And I think both of my parents have that actually in a different way, but they both have that enthusiasm about group experiences. One of my fondest childhood memories is making music together. So my father playing the guitar a little, my mother singing, and they always tell me that when I was 2, 3 years old, they didn't allow me to sing with them. They closed the door because they were actually recording those songs and making tapes and I was banging the door literally because I wanted to sing along. So at one point I was allowed and I knew the songs and I would sing with them. And especially the improvisation was, very rich. Very rich and very fulfilling, like soul food, I would say.
is that also then maybe a reason why you use music, singing, as a metaphor or a method in your work?
Absolutely, absolutely.
And I've read some of your things, so but maybe you can explain a bit about the listeners in terms of how that works.
So do you want me to say a little bit about my research and making that link from my roots to
Yeah, let's do
musicality?
that. Yeah, because now I'm blanking on the word. Polyphony
Polyphony,
is
yes.
important, right? So yeah, tell us a
Yes.
bit about the research, because I really think that's crucial of what you're trying to do, and
Yeah.
yeah.
So maybe one step back about the research, and this word is already beautiful, researching. So it's not about what we already know and confirm, let's say, mainstream knowledge, but searching and finding new questions and answers. And so the paradigm that I was educated in is action research. And I did that within a program at a university in the UK, a business school in the UK. And there are a few principles, and it might be nice to say a little bit about that in terms of context. And then I'll dive into why my roots are an important inspiration and why I landed on musicality as an answer, if that's okay. So in terms of paradigm, one of the assumptions is that it's important to acknowledge different ways of knowing. They call it other ways of knowing, not just the cognitive and intellectual, but also embodied knowing, practical knowing, um, artful knowing. So things we make or craft as a way into different answers and different questions. And emergence is really important. So rather than having an hypothesis beforehand and trying to prove or to find data in relation to that hypothesis, it might be that the questions in your inquiry evolve over time, and as you inquire into change, but because the faculty is an organizational change, as you change, your questions change and the answers change. So it's a very radically different approach than, let's say, the more mainstream way of doing research. And then subjectivity is very important. So assuming that if we both have the same question, we will look at it differently and our answers will be different. So how we view the world has a huge impact on what we find, the questions we even ask, but also the answers we find, because subjectivity is key, and we can't be objective when it comes to doing research in a social system. And maybe the last thing I'll say in terms of paradigms is that it comes from a participatory paradigm where the assumption is that we are part of the world, in the world, but even made of the same stuff. So there isn't a separation between what I'm actually looking at and myself, which in the Western world is a very radically different way of looking at things. And I think that listeners from other parts of the world might find this very, common sense. So those principles inspired me or brought me to a very surprising outcome. When I started my research, I thought, I teach at a business university around teams. Of course, I'm going to explore team development, and I might find the new model or piece of knowledge around how teams develop, like the new version of Bruce Tuckman's very popular forming, storming, non-performing view on groups and
Jeanine,
teams.
one second, sorry to interrupt you, because the listeners don't know. So you're teaching at Nijrode University in the Netherlands, right? And you decided, or I don't know how that happened, but your PhD research was done in the UK. So that's
Elsewhere. Yeah. It's
elsewhere.
a partner business school. Yeah.
Okay.
So
Okay.
Esrich, it's now Halt actually in the UK, is a partner university business school from Nijrode.
Okay, got it.
I wanted to do research from a different perspective, and one of my colleagues at Nijrode inspired me to go there. Absolutely. Although it's very much also supported by Nijrode, I did go to a different school. Absolutely.
Sorry that I interrupted you. Yeah. So
That's okay. And so my assumption was doing research on team development within the context of a business university, and then creating the new version of a team model. But then, as we were guided in that process, one of the main questions is like, what really matters to you? What is your contribution to the world, and how does that? How is that? based on who you are, because if you ask a question that isn't related to who you deeply are, then there's this chance of objectifying and reducing reality. And so it's very important to view yourself as part of the question, the evolving question. Rilke the poet's living questions. It's really about the living questions that are deeply within, that we can't quickly and directly address, because they matter more. They are not the easy questions, but the more challenging ones. And so at one point I would face questions like, why groups, Jeanine? Why groups? And what is it to you? And what is your own experience in groups? And why does it matter? And so then part of the story I just shared with you about my roots came along. But also, if I look very honestly at what I was doing at Nijrode, I didn't necessarily recognize myself in some of the modules I was teaching. So I was showing a PowerPoint with something that someone thought of some years ago. And when I was teaching it, I wasn't really feeling that that was my view of groups. I didn't really recognize myself. And that sort of started to bother me. Also, I started to dig into the origins of group development and group dynamics. So who are the theorists and thinkers? And I started to dive into their context and the time that those models were developed, and realizing that they were actually subjective, but weren't presented as subjective. So, for instance, Wilfred Bion, one of the main thinkers who actually coined the term, he has a very typical background that really influenced his way of being in the world and his knowing and the process of his theorizing. So, for instance, he was an officer in the Second World War. And when he did his work as a therapist, he did that in a closed hospital for traumatized soldiers. And those observations, and it's interesting because his observations, you can easily find them. So you can literally see his theorizing and his thinking and his development. Those conditions weren't actually subtitled in translating those ways of thinking in his theory, and they are still used to this day. So his theories around assumptions in groups, that there is a lot of anxiety in groups, is still very mainstream. And I wouldn't say that it's not true that there's anxiety in groups. I just want to say that there's a certain context and origin that this was developed. And so I started to explore and listen to his voice as he was literally talking about groups, and go into his own background and questions you asked me about, your story. He had his story, and that really inspired me to then think maybe there are different ways of looking at groups that are more in line with the diversity of this day and age, and also add vitality, because also concerning thinking about groups didn't change much since those days. So since the 50s and 40s, the main theories are still the main theories, and their applications and how they still influence change consultants, academics, still very alive. And so that inspired me to look at groups differently and see what can I maybe add or open or change when it comes to a more reflexive way of looking at groups. And so then musicality became an answer, because that's something that I deeply know, or I believe we all know. And I started to listen to my own voice as a little girl singing in a group, and realizing that I was just singing and making music without knowing intellectually what I was doing, but it's really part of life, music, and it's close to heart. And it became a true inspiration in many ways. Yeah.
Can you allude a little bit more about that? Because you mentioned already before the embodied polyphony. What does that
Yes.
mean then?
Yes. So polyphony is a term that actually comes from a Russian philosopher, Bakhtin, and he came up with this term as a notion that every moment is highly diverse, because every voice, as I speak now, for instance, I'm influenced by my ancestors, by my friends, my family, the time I live in, the voices I hear on the news. It's a very rich moment of diversity as I'm speaking to you right now. Voice in metaphorical sense, so voice as in what's an opinion or thought I have, but also voice, and that's something that I added, and that hence the term embodied. Also, literally, there's a lot of research now from, for instance, MIT, that our voice changes over time, but also changes and alters the moment we start to speak to someone else. So we are so relational, innately relational, that the moment I talk to my mom instead of you, my voice changes. I don't hear it, but they can really tell the difference between the two. So I think that voice is a very underestimated element in thinking about groups, but actually thinking about life. And embodied is important because a lot of the theories around groups and teams, they prefer to look at the rational and verbal part of that. So the content of what we're saying and not what we sound like when we say it. So for instance, Bion's work, to refer back to him, he puts a lot of emphasis on the difference in people's opinions, for instance. But I don't get any clue on all the other embodied data that it could have been part of what he came up with. And I think that it's important to add it to be more inclusive in our ways of knowing, more relevant, because I don't think I need to tell you how important the body is as a form of knowing and being and relating to the world. And voice and polyphony for me very much relate to how I love to talk about groups, because there's always room for another voice. There's always room for another part of knowing or another perspective. And polyphony then relates to, this is singing technique, so I sing still in my free time in a choir. There's a high note of diversity in polyphony, more so than in other types of singing. Layers of difference in every single second in terms of voice. So that for me was a very rich concept.
Yeah. When I'm listening to you, it reminds me, but you tell me if I'm off. What I try to do during these conversations is, ask people also about if they are familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, because I think that's important, trying to make our world more just and sustainable. We identified as a world 17 SDG, Sustainable Development Goals. We are not reaching those. We are behind on, 15 to 20% on average. And then this growing group of people said, one of the reasons that we are not reaching those goals, not making the system changes and process changes that we need, has to do with that we did not pay, or we are not paying proper attention to the ability, skills, and knowledge of the individual as well as communities, groups. And they came up with the inner development goals, 5 inner development goals: being, thinking, relating, collaborating, and acting. Then they identified 23 skills, right? Like empathy, critical thinking. Is that a relationship with, what you were trying to get at in your study?
I think so, in many different ways. The first thing that comes up for me when you say this, or really summarize, is that it's the connection between the outer world and the inner world. And I think that's important. So I also have a tendency sometimes to speak in terms of either or. It's one or the other. And while there's actually the paradox that we create more difference in the outer world when we create more change in the inner world. It's not either or, but it's very tempting to speak in those terms. And indeed, when I connect this to voice and polyphony, the interesting thing is that we have different voices. We have an outer voice, the way we sound as we speak and others hear us, but that's actually the irony that we cannot hear it ourselves because we can only hear the voice that's in our ears. And to connect those is really powerful, those two voices. And There's the connection with change, obviously, in many different ways, and that requires different ways of knowing and being. Actually, for me, so I recently came across to the IDGs, and I went to the conference in Stockholm last year. And I was a little bit skeptical, to be honest, because as I just said, I was inquiring into different kind of models. So my first response from a research perspective is to look at what's the story behind the model. Model is never the answer. There's always a story, and it's also a simplification. But what I actually loved as an addition to many other models is that it also includes being, which for me it's such a fundamental and rich dimension. So that's something that I really loved, and that I also found a lot of answers in terms of what I call orientation. So it's very much about how do you relate, how are you the goal yourself. We can talk about change, other people need to change and the world needs to change, but how are you living the change yourself, and not in terms of right or wrong, but living the dilemmas and the paradoxes and the difficulties, and sharing those. I have a few colleagues at Nijrode who hold the title professor of sustainability or something similar. And one of them recently shared how she was struggling with flying, for instance, that she's invited to all kinds of conferences, and she step into an airplane or not. And I think that is part of being the change, is showing that even, as a professor in the field, you struggle, and you're human. And yeah, those are two thoughts that come up when you invite me to think about that link.
I would like to go back to the music and actually it is, yeah. So what I've been discussing with some of my guests is a skit of Sesame Street, where Ernie wants to learn how to play the saxophone. So he's picked up the saxophone, he's playing, and every time he plays, you hear the squeaky sound. My listeners already know about this, but I'm going to repeat it anyway again. And why is there a squeaky sound when he's trying to play the saxophone? Because he holds on to his ducky. He always walks around with his ducky. And so he holds on to his ducky, and that's why you hear this squeaky sound. So his band members are saying, Ernie, if you really want to learn how to play the saxophone, you need to put your ducky down. That doesn't mean that he cannot pick his ducky up again. But so what is your ducky?
What a wonderful question. Um, the answer that comes up for me is that I've been sharing about that little girl in Alkmaar telling you that I was exotic. And I think that's a story I keep holding on to, because it was meaningful for a while, because it was important to acknowledge that part. Because, as I said earlier, also, I was born into a diverse family. We didn't talk about that difference. So for me to realize or find out that I might be a little exotic for others was a realization. But I also think that now, and maybe also in the world we're living in now, it's important to look at that with fresh eyes. And when I share this story of being exotic and different, and I ask, and that's actually part of my facilitation practice now, I ask the participants in the room, what is your version? We all have a version. I had a guy in the room, he was extremely tall, for instance, and he said, the first thing people see when they meet me is my height. And it's a simple version of my own story. And I think it's time to, I wouldn't say let go, but maybe hold the story differently, as in maybe I'm not so exotic because we are all different and the same at the same time. And I heard myself say to you that it's not either or. So of course it's a infinite movement between sameness and difference. Yeah.
Is it?
If that makes sense.
Yeah, no,
I was thinking out loud, but I love this question.
it does. While you were, trying to answer the question, I was trying to link it with something you said before in terms of, your study. Basically, you say you have to embrace the subjectivity, your perspectives, and so maybe you need to learn how to not. You don't necessarily need to put the ducky down. You need to, know how to hold the ducky,
Yeah.
right? Or
Oh,
or
this,
make use
yeah.
of that sound as part of your saxophone.
Yes. It, what comes up for me now is a thought that, let's see if I can grab it. It's hold it differently, you said. Um one of the faculty members in the education I had on action research, Margaret Geertje, she talks of poetic activism. And the beauty of poetic activism is that it comes from a place of interconnectedness, and it could be very small and humble. So I'm not the type of person to really demonstrate, and not very vocal in my objections, but I've been developing actually and trying to develop a way of activism and voice that is sort of on the edge and challenging a bit. Um, but it requires the acknowledgement that, there's sameness and difference, that there's both, and intersubjectivity, we're related. And then finding a new voice in myself is actually one that says this matters. And musicality and looking at groups from or with a musical ear has value. I think I still have a tendency to be a little bit modest in that sense. And yeah, I've been invited by many to share more of what I've been doing, and I'm trying to find the voice to do so.
I think you're doing fine so far. So let us continue to piggyback on this. Given the role music and polyphony play in your life and research, is there a song or a piece of music that captures how you show up in the world?
So my friends and family know that there's always music in my body and mind. So the whole day there was a song playing in my head. And it's from Sarah Bareilles. And it starts like this. All the colors of the rainbow hidden my skin. Hearts have colors, don't we all know? Red runs through our veins. And Kaleidoscope Heart for me is, what comes up the whole day. It's about the colorfulness in all of us.
No, thank you for sharing that. And so just for your information and to remind the listeners, so we made a playlist on Spotify called, which you search for #walktalklisten, you see all the songs that have been selected or were mentioned by my guest that I spoke with about, music. So I will add Sarah Bareilles as well. I wish, I could add this particular rendition, but I'm
I see
assuming
it on
you don't
fire.
have that on Spotify. So
Oh,
um,
no, no worries.
thanks, Jeanine. Um, you know, this podcast is a spin-off of 100 Mile Walk that I started in 2012. And then in 2020, I think I was not able to be accompanied by other walkers because of COVID. So then I started this virtual walk. Um, but a question that I often ask, not always, is, if you would be asked to walk 100 miles in a week or in 5 days, so that means 15 to 20 miles a day, for which cause or for which reason would you walk?
I would definitely walk for, I don't like this word, but I'm using it for refugees, people who are fleeing their country and are in no man's land. Um, because I think the horror of losing your home in the metaphorical sense, leaving friends, family, and not being welcome elsewhere, I think it's one of the most inhumane situations. And not too long ago, I was at a refugee camp. So I literally saw families trying to even build a home there. I saw people who tried to create a little garden before their tent. Like, they didn't have a square meter, but they created a little garden. And having my Dutch passport in my pocket, literally, I didn't. Why do I have this passport? I didn't do anything to deserve that. We created borders, and with flags, we sort of said, "This is our land. This is my land," and we call it da 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 the Netherlands. Or it's a privilege, and also a very weird privilege I had. I felt the pain of being there, and I think it's very, heart-wrenching and awful the way we deal with that at the moment. So that would be the cause for sure.
Um, I think, the fact that people are fleeing or have to flee the country. I mean, nobody would like to flee. Um, it's leading also to a lot of polarization in the world. And actually, the previous guest of the podcast has a question around that polarization. So what the question that he has for you is,
This is an interesting one. I feel like we're in an environment where there's so much polarization. And my question is, what do you do with all the rage? How do you channel it?
And the rage around me and the rage within, probably, which is
yes,
connected.
yeah,
So this question is a beautiful mirror, because I wouldn't say I'm the type of person that easily is in touch with my own rage. So rage for me easily translates into grief or sadness or pain. Um, and I would say that when I look at polarization, I like to look at it from close in. So literally my neighborhood, how people are discussing sensitive topics, for instance, and how they are tolerant or not for difference. And what I try to do is to meet that with as much curiosity and love as I can, and also looking at my own polarization. So what do I easily put into black and white boxes? Because I also do it all the time, and I literally, I'm in a metaphor of, for instance, having a biracial background. Black and white but I actually talk about it myself in those terms. And so I think it's innately human to polarize, and I try to breathe and notice that I'm doing it, and trying to have an open heart for myself and those around me, very close in, who are also polarizing. But that's a very small act, I would say. I don't have a large, grand answer to this. Absolutely not. My day-to-day work, in which I work with groups, I try to work with the difference, the polarization in the room when it's there. But it's hard and it's challenging. And there are also honestly times where I really close the curtains when it comes to what's happening in the world right now. I can't look at it every single day and face it. So my answer is close in. My own version of polarization in the here and now is the most I can do, I think.
Your question for the next guest.
So when it comes to my own journey and what I've been exploring, belonging has been a huge term and theme for me. And I think that and this relates to polarization, but also to the pandemic. It's not so obvious for people to be in groups, face to face in a group of people for a longer period of time and just be with whatever is there and notice and feel that you belong. So my question is, how do you know, and I mean knowing in a deep way, in a deep level, that you belong in a group? And maybe you have an example, because I think it's more and more rare and more important, therefore, to know that this is where I belong and how I belong, and to take that deep knowing and translate that into something that's worthwhile. May I say a little bit about what I just said about belonging and the deeper knowing? So, because it answers a question you asked me earlier about musicality.
Yeah.
When I sing in a group, people, we don't have to know each other. I don't have to know their background. When we make music, it doesn't have to be perfect singing or anything. We don't have to be professionals, but I feel that I belong when we make music together. And that for me is a huge source of information that I could get inspiration of and try to build on and add value. And I think everybody has different answers. So if that person knows his or her their version, they could use that and spread that and share that even more. And we need more belonging in the world. So that's why I answered that question, or gave that question, and
Yeah.
links to musicality for me.
Then I still have a question around that about your belonging and singing together. Then, because you mentioned around polyphony, is that the same as harmony? And how is that then in terms of interactions between people in groups?
Lovely. I laugh because no, there's harmonizing, which is a verb, is an act. Harmonizing means finding the difference, having just enough difference so it's interesting to listen to, but not too much, because then it's out of key. But it's not the same as harmony, because some of the most interesting music has dissonance in it. So what is interesting to listen to is a version of difference. And I mean, that's the whole point of being in a group. If if you're by yourself, there's no difference. But when you have the difference in the group, that makes it interesting to listen to, whether it's, metaphorically speaking, when it comes to opinions and thoughts or feelings, or when it comes to the literal sense of listening to voices in a room. So this is actually a misunderstanding that could be created. Polyphony is not the same. Embodied polyphony, as I view it, is not the same as creating harmony. That's not the point. It's about inviting an interesting level of sameness and difference.
These conversations always go fast. But before I thank you, is there any question that I did not ask you today that I should have asked you?
We didn't talk about what's next, in the sense of, we talked about my roots and my history, and we talked about research, which is finalized since July. And so I'm working on a dream. And this came from an intuition, and that's that I'd like to do a little work on the African continent around groups and education and knowing in the broad sense of the word. And so I'm exploring moving to South Africa for a while with my family, in collaboration with Nijrode, also to do some research and look at leadership practices and group development from different contexts. And this is a word that I don't use lightly, to add to decolonization of business education at the moment, to challenge the way we look at organizations and change and teams from a very, I would say, Western perspective. And that's something that I'm very enthusiastic about and would love to have more conversations about. And it's not, set in stone when we're going and what we'll be doing there, but that's one of the dreams I'm working on at the moment.
And if people are intrigued by this, how can they contact you to know more?
LinkedIn might be the easiest answer.
Yeah, we will make sure that we mention that in the podcast notes. So, wow, intriguing. So, yeah, thank you so much for your willingness to talk with me today and for everything you do, Jeanine. And all the best.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your wonderful questions. Time flew by, and I think that's a very good sign. That's very good sign.
That was great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for listening to Walk, Talk, Listen. Please check us out on 100mile.org or follow us on Facebook or Instagram.